For over 70 years, nobody believed that Bigfoot kidnapped civilians in Portlock, Alaska, until I used an AI to analyze it. What it found has left scientists clueless, and even the smartest Bigfoot experts are wondering if they ever want to return to Portlock after learning about the truth. The population of Portlock is never more than a few hundred nowadays, completely abandoned by 1950, with the official reason listed as economic decline. The Alutiiq people who actually lived there gave a different reason. Something at the edges of the settlement was making itself known, deliberately, one encounter at a time. What follows is what the data said, layer by layer. The way the system built its conclusion from 6 independent data sets that had never been read together until now, and what it means that they all point at the same thing. The Alutiiq oral accounts were the opening data set. And before you check out because those words just appeared on your screen, stay with me, because the AI wasn't doing what you might expect. It wasn't evaluating these stories for truth. It wasn't trying to decide whether the people telling them were right or wrong, reliable or unreliable, culturally biased or not. That's not what the system was built to do, and that framing would have poisoned the analysis anyway. What it was doing was running a behavioral coherence test. In plain English, it was asking whether Bigfoot being described across all these different accounts from different communities spanning different years was behaving like a real and consistent animal, or whether it was behaving like a legend. I'd worked long enough in wildlife research to know that the behavioral signature of a real animal is almost impossible to fake across independent testimonies. Real animals have territories, feeding patterns, seasonal movements, predictable responses to pressure. Their behavior is constrained by ecology. A legend has no ecology to answer to. It can do whatever the story needs it to do. That distinction sounds subtle, but it's one of the most powerful tools in the system's analytical toolkit. Legends accumulate contradictions as they spread. Details drift. Bigfoot gets bigger, faster, more supernatural with each retelling. Different storytellers add things that don't match the previous version. You can spot a legend in the data because it behaves the way legends behave. Growing, shifting, inconsistent at the edges, shaped more by the needs of the storyteller than by the logic of a real organism. These Alutiiq accounts didn't behave like a legend. Multiple communities, no meaningful contact with each other, spanning roughly 15 years, described the same entity in language that lined up at the behavioral level. Large, bipedal, capable of moving through dense Sitka spruce forest at speed without making noise. Aggressive near the fish camps on the coast, particularly when people approached alone or at the edges of the settlement. The specific details varied the way eyewitness accounts of the same real thing tend to vary, not the way fabricated stories drift apart. The system wasn't reading this as proof. It was reading it as a signal worth following. But the most important finding from the testimony analysis wasn't the consistency. It was a specific pattern in Bigfoot aggression that the system flagged almost immediately. When the AI mapped where the aggressive Bigfoot encounters were happening, it noticed something that didn't fit the standard predator profile. The incidents weren't scattered randomly across the landscape. They weren't clustering near food sources, near game trails or salmon runs, or the places where a hungry animal would logically be spending most of its time. They were clustering near boundary points, near the fish camps at the water's edge, near the trails connecting the village interior to the coastline, near the routes people used to move between inside and outside the settlement, near the crossing points. There's a rule in predator behavior that's about as close to universal as ecology gets. Predators attack where the food is. A hungry bear does not care about your fence line. It cares about your fish. But what the AI was reading in these testimonies didn't look like hunger. The aggression wasn't concentrated at food sources. It was concentrated at transition zones, the places where people crossed from one space into another, the places where you stepped over a line. The system flagged it with a specific notation that I kept returning to throughout the entire project. The aggression in these accounts clusters around boundary points, not around prey. That distinction matters enormously, and it was about to matter even more, because the RCMP patrol logs were going to draw that boundary on an actual map. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police patrol logs from the Portlock area were never classified. They were sitting in regional archives, accessible to anyone who requested them, filed away in the forgettable manner of bureaucratic paperwork that nobody imagined would ever matter. The problem was that nobody had ever read them as a connected set. Between 1939 and 1949, RCMP officers filed a series of reports documenting what they described as large, unidentified animal signs along specific coastal trail corridors near the settlement. Each report, read on its own, got a reasonable individual explanation: a big bear moving through the area, a logging disturbance that left unusual ground marks, an unclear track that probably had some mundane origin. Individually, each was dismissible, the kind of marginal field note that gets logged and forgotten. Collectively, I think they were something the officers had no framework to recognize. The AI was the first system to read them as a connected data set, and what emerged from that spatial mapping was immediate and impossible to ignore. The incidents didn't scatter randomly across the landscape. When the system plotted them geographically, they mapped onto a corridor, a consistent, repeating path that traced a wide arc around the settlement. The corridor followed the salmon drainage east, ran along the coastal bluff line, climbed to the ridge line above the village, then curved back down toward the lagoon. The same general route, the same elevation band, documented across 10 years of separate reports from different officers working different rotations who had no reason to connect what they were individually observing. 10 years with different men and different seasons, all in the same path. The system ran this corridor against known brown bear territorial behavior, since brown bears are the largest territorial animals on the Kenai Peninsula, and the most obvious explanation for a decade of large animal sign along coastal trails. From what I know, bears use a radial movement pattern. They range outward from a denning site, cover ground in multiple directions, and return. Their territory looks like a wheel with spokes. What the AI was looking at wasn't radial, it was circumferential. The path wasn't moving through the area from point A to point B. It was moving around something, maintaining a consistent distance from a fixed center point, returning to the same waypoints across multiple years at intervals that suggested a scheduled routine rather than opportunistic travel. This was not the pattern of an animal looking for food. I believe this was the pattern of an animal that already knew exactly where everything was and was checking on it. Using the AI system, I ran a boundary calculation from the corridor endpoints and produced a result that made me go very quiet. Portlock was inside it, not at the edge of Bigfoot's territory, not adjacent to it or bordering it, but inside it. The village hadn't been built on the boundary of a Sasquatch's range. It had been built in the middle of that range, and for more than a decade, a Bigfoot had been calmly, methodically, consistently walking the perimeter around it, checking the same points, running the same arc, season after season, year after year, while the people living inside had no idea the fence existed. However, what the cannery records added next was the detail that transformed a disturbing geometric finding into something I found considerably harder to sit with. The cannery at Portlock operated from the early 1900s through 1950, and like any remote industrial operation of that era, it kept meticulous records. Worker logs tracking who was on site each day, injury reports documenting accidents on the floor and on the water, absences logged when men didn't show for their shifts. Disappearances blamed on Bigfoot were recorded when workers went out and didn't come back. Standard paperwork for a dangerous industry in a remote location, the kind of documentation that accumulates quietly over decades and then sits in boxes, unread, because nobody expects it to mean anything. Read individually, the way they had always been read, these records told the unsurprising story of a hard-living community in a brutal environment. People got hurt, people went missing. Remote Alaska in the 1940s was not a safe place to work, and the absence of a laborer didn't raise flags the way it might somewhere else. It was logged and moved on from. The AI I ran didn't read them individually. It plotted every incident on a map. What came out of that spatial analysis was a Bigfoot pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for 70 years. Not because anyone concealed it, but because nobody had ever laid all the data points down in the same place at the same time and looked at where they fell. The incidents were not distributed evenly across the settlement. They were concentrated at the perimeter, workers who spent their days logging in the outer tree line away from the main operation. Fishermen who ran the coastal routes alone rather than in pairs or groups. A surveyor who had spent 3 days working the ridgeline above the village with 2 colleagues and came back on the 3rd day by himself. The incidents clustered at the places where people moved alone, away from the center of activity, out toward the margins of the settlement. The interior of the community, the cannery floor, the residential quarters, the main dock area where crews worked together, produced almost no incidents at all. People who stayed in the center, who worked around other people in numbers, who didn't push out to the edges, were not the people who ended up in those reports. The people who went to the edges were not coming back at the rate you'd expect, even from a dangerous industry in a remote location. Now the system flagged this carefully because there are alternative explanations. Edge work is genuinely riskier than interior work. Logging in the outer tree line is objectively more dangerous than operating machinery on a cannery floor. Fishing alone is statistically more dangerous than working the dock with a full crew. The incident clustering could reflect occupational hazard rather than anything external. But the spatial pattern went a step further than occupational risk could account for. The incidents weren't evenly distributed along the perimeter. They were concentrated at the specific points where the circumferential corridor, already mapped from the patrol logs, ran closest to the settlement. The incidents were clustering at the exact locations where Bigfoot boundary intersected with the routes people used to move in and out. I pulled the 2 maps up side by side, Bigfoot patrol corridor from the RCMP logs and the incident clusters from the cannery records, and overlaid them. Then I realized that it wasn't removing prey. It was removing pressure. Bigfoot wasn't just maintaining that boundary passively. According to the combined data, it had been enforcing it, not with the indiscriminate aggression of a predator clearing a zone out of hunger or fear, selectively at the margins, at the crossing points, in a pattern that the system's behavioral classification flagged as something closer to territorial management than predation. A Sasquatch that knew the difference between the people at the center and the people at the edges, removing the ones who crossed the line, leaving everyone else alone. Little did I know, the physical evidence from Resurrection Creek was about to tell the system what kind of animal thinks that way. In 1973, a set of plaster casts was made from Bigfoot footprints found along Resurrection Creek, roughly 12 miles inland from the Portlock site. Physical evidence, dimensionless, carrying no memory, immune to the accusations of bias and motivated interpretation that follow every other data source in this investigation. Just the preserved geometry of a Bigfoot that had walked through creek bank mud more than 2 decades after the village went quiet. The prints measured 14 inches in length. The AI ran biomechanical analysis from the cast dimensions and the stride pattern between prints. The stride length combined with the depth of impressions in the sediment pointed to a subject somewhere between 430 and 470 pounds, moving bipedally. And then the detail the system flagged as particularly significant. Across the entire track, on uneven, wet, unstable creek bank terrain, there was not a single irregular depth variation in any of the prints. No stumbling, no compensation steps where one foot sank deeper because the other had slipped. No moments of lost balance on loose substrate that would show up as asymmetric impressions. If you've ever tried to walk along a muddy creek bank, you know what that means. Your feet sink differently depending on what's under them. You adjust constantly and leave a messy, uneven record in the mud of your struggle with uncertain footing. A Bigfoot in the 430 to 470 pound range, heavier than a mature male grizzly, heavier than most animals that move on 2 legs anywhere on Earth, crossing that surface with 0 variation in depth or stride consistency, was not moving on instinct. It was moving with the kind of unhurried, automatic confidence that only comes from knowing a piece of ground so well that your body navigates it without your brain having to think about it. I looked at the depth variance data for a long time. In my field work, I'd cast and analyzed hundreds of large predator tracks. I knew what uneven terrain does to even the most sure-footed animals. I knew that whatever made these has been walking that ground its entire life. That alone would have been worth flagging. But the most important detail from the cast analysis wasn't the biomechanics. It was the location and the nature of the impressions themselves. Resurrection Creek ran along the interior edge of the perimeter corridor the system had already mapped from the patrol logs. And the casts weren't from a Bigfoot passing through on its way somewhere else. They were from a Bigfoot that had stopped. Multiple overlapping impressions at the same spot, indicating a stationary interval of meaningful length. Not traveling, but standing still. Facing, based on the orientation of the toe impressions, in one direction, toward the village. A Sasquatch had stood at the interior edge of its own territory, looking toward the settlement, at some point in 1973, 23 years after the last person left. The system noted this in its output with a precision that landed harder than any dramatic framing could have. Subject stationary, oriented inward, at the interior boundary margin, 23 years post-abandonment. It was still checking, still watching the place where the people used to be. I'm happy to say that the next lagoon footage was going to close the circuit on what that meant. The footage was shot in 1991 by a fisherman who happened to have a consumer video camera out on the water with him, 40 seconds long, shaky, shot across open water toward the far tree line, the way you'd grab your camera if you saw something you weren't sure you were actually seeing. Bigfoot moving along the tree line at the edge of the lagoon, crossing a gap in the vegetation, disappearing back into the spruce. The kind of footage that, watched once by someone without the right analytical tools, gets filed under inconclusive and set aside forever. The AI didn't just watch it, it ran it through a sequence of analyses, one after another, and each one added a layer to the picture. Costume compensation patterns first, the algorithmic process of determining whether a human in a suit could produce the observed movement characteristics given the visible limb ratios and gait mechanics. Zero match at any of the standard suit configurations. Then limb ratio and gait profile analysis compared against the physical profile derived from the Resurrection Creek casts. The proportions and stride mechanics of the figure in the footage were consistent with Bigfoot that had left those prints in creek bank mud 18 years earlier and 12 miles away. Then weight estimation from ground impact analysis using the compression of soft ground visible at the edge of the tree line to back calculate the subject's mass, between 440 and 480 pounds. I pulled up the 1973 cast measurements on a second monitor. I placed the two weight estimates side by side and didn't say anything for a moment. The number from the 1973 mud and the number from the 1991 video were the same number within the margin of measurement error. The same Bigfoot, the same physical profile, the same behavioral territory, nearly 2 decades apart. The system had established continuity across 18 years and 12 miles. The same Sasquatch, still out there, still moving through the same landscape it had always claimed as its own. But it was the behavioral analysis, what Bigfoot was actually doing in those 40 seconds, that made the AI's conclusion impossible to soften or qualify. The figure was not crossing the lagoon edge. It was running the lagoon edge, moving parallel to the shoreline at a consistent distance, tracking the boundary where the water met the tree line, neither approaching the fisherman nor retreating from him, maintaining its line, indifferent to being observed. The system recognized the movement signature because it had already classified it from the patrol log corridor analysis and from the literature on territorial great apes, perimeter patrol, the behavioral pattern of an animal running the boundary of an established range. Not a feeding run, not a threat display, and not flight. A Bigfoot doing a boundary check, confirming the line was still where it was supposed to be. At that point, the AI stopped hedging. The system's formal output stated it directly. The behavioral profile, physical continuity, territorial geometry, and spatial aggression pattern across all 6 data sets were consistent with one conclusion. Portlock sat inside the long-term home range of a Sasquatch, a single Bigfoot, or a lineage maintaining inherited territory that had claimed this land before the cannery was built, defended it through 4 decades of human occupation, and was still actively patrolling it 41 years after the last family left. Here's what I found when my AI assembled the full picture. a circumferential travel corridor documented across 10 years of RCMP patrol logs, running a consistent arc around a settlement that had been built inside it without anyone knowing. Oral testimony from multiple unconnected Alutiiq communities describing aggression concentrated specifically at the boundary crossing points where that corridor approached the village. Incident data from cannery records clustering at the perimeter, spatially aligned with the boundary corridor, concentrated at the marginal spaces where people worked alone and away from the group. A physical impression site at the interior edge of the corridor, made by a Bigfoot facing inward toward the village, found more than 2 decades after the settlement emptied. And 40 seconds of video from 1991 showing the same Sasquatch on the same patrol route, still running the same line. The conclusion the system reached wasn't that a Bigfoot had attacked Portlock. The conclusion was more specific and in some ways more unsettling because it implied intent rather than aggression. Bigfoot had claimed that territory long before the cannery was built, before the first workers arrived on that coastline, before the settlement existed in any form. For the decade between roughly 1940 and 1950, it had been communicating its position the only way available to it, through pressure at the edges, consequences at the crossing points, a perimeter walked so consistently that a decade of law enforcement documentation had recorded its patrol schedule without anyone understanding what they were reading. I sat with the final output for a while without talking. What the system was describing wasn't a monster. It wasn't an aggressive unknown predator responding to intrusion with indiscriminate violence. It was something considerably harder to fit into a comfortable category. A Sasquatch managing a territory with the patience and consistency of something that understood on some level that it could afford to wait, that the calculus would eventually work out in its favor. The territory Bigfoot had maintained since before the cannery opened, the same territory the patrol logs tracked, the same territory the testimonies described, the same territory where a Sasquatch left impressions in creek bank mud while facing inward toward an empty village, was still being maintained in 1991, 41 years after the last family moved out, still patrolling, still checking the line at regular intervals, apparently seeing no reason to change. What keeps coming back, sitting with this data the way we've been sitting with it, isn't the disappearances. It isn't the patrol logs or the footage or the prints. It's the patience. A Bigfoot that didn't escalate, didn't wipe the settlement out, didn't make itself impossible to ignore. Applied targeted, consistent pressure at the margins, year after year, the same locations, the same behavioral signature, and waited long enough for the humans to make the calculation themselves. When they finally did, it didn't follow them. It just went back to walking the fence. Portlock was never a village at the edge of the wilderness. It was an enclosure inside a Sasquatch's home range. A Bigfoot had claimed that land long before the first family arrived to build on it, and for 40 years, the people who lived there never knew there was something walking the fence line just beyond the tree line. They just knew that the people who went to the edges didn't always come back, and eventually that was enough.